I finished reading Petersburg by Andrey Bely. This is a novel of the Russian symbolist movement, which I've talked about a little bit when I read um, The Petty Demon by Fyodor Sologub. But I think this book is probably even a little more famous than that one. It's probably the the novel, I would say, of the symbolist movement. Although honestly, I liked it a lot, but I think I liked it slightly less than that one. But anyways, Vladimir Nabokov was famously a fan of this, and there's a quote from him at the start of the introduction here. It says, "My greatest masterpieces of the 20th century sorry, my greatest masterpieces of 20th century prose," Vladimir Nabokov has said, "are, in this order, Joyce's Ulysses, Kafka's Transformation, Bely's Petersburg, and the first half of Proust's fairy tale In Search of Lost Time." End quote. Very Nabokov of him to be like, yes, Proust is on the list, but only the first half of his work. It's just really funny that he had to specify that. But yeah, this is, according to Nabokov, the third best work of prose of the 20th century at whatever time Nabokov said that. Uh, I did like it a lot. I feel like it took me a while to get into this. This is definitely something that would benefit from a reread. Um, but by the end, I was enjoying it a lot. Uh, so this book is about our main character Nikolai Apollonovich Ablayukhov. He is the son of like a government official in Imperial Russia, and this book takes place right around the time of the 1905 Russian Revolution, not to be confused with the two later Russian revolutions of 1917. They had one at the start of 1917 and then one towards the end. Um, I think a lot of people maybe don't even know that there was two separate ones. But even fewer people are aware that there was one in 1905, which forced the Tsar to let them have a parliament, the Duma. Um, but anyways, this book takes place around that time, and our main character is the son of a government official, but he's also involved in these revolutionary groups. And kind of the big conflict of the novel is that um, the revolutionary group has um, tasked Nikolai with assassinating his own father with a bomb. And he sort of spends the novel like uh, sort of fighting with himself over whether he's going to do it, and then he decides, no, I can't do this, but then he has to go find where he put the bomb so that he can dispose of it safely. And there's lots of problems that happen along the way to that. Um, and then the other thing going on is that he's got uh, these two friends who are a couple, um, and I think it's implied that he maybe had some past romantic involvement with the woman from this couple. Um, but he's on his way to a masquerade ball dressed up as a red domino with a mask and a big mustache. Um, and that's where the cover of this edition comes from. But while he's masked, he's just acting like an idiot and like flopping around on the ground in front of this woman, and she like takes offense to it. It like offends her sensibilities or whatever. Um, and her husband um, is deeply offended at the fact that Nikolai would act in a way to offend his woman, and he also like, I again, I think it's implied that there was a past romantic involvement and that he realizes it as a result of this incident. Um, so that's the other conflict that's kind of going on in the background. Um, so that's the plot, really, is just those two conflicts playing out. Um, and but along the way, we get a lot of like psychological information about all of the characters, really. It's not quite stream of consciousness, but we get a lot of thoughts from each of the characters, and but I most of the time though we're with either Nikolai or his father Apollon. Um, and I think the two of them are supposed to sort of stand in for these two generations of Russian men. Um, and I think there's a lot of symbolism to the fact that the revolution is asking the younger generation to murder his own father. Um, Not that I feel like we're really supposed to sympathize with his father. He's a funny character, but a deeply unlikable character. Um, but we don't want his son to have to kill him, you know. So that's going on there. Uh, there's a lot of like references to philosophy, and I think that's another way in which I would probably benefit from rereading this book. Hello. Um, in particular, there's a lot of just like passing references to Kant and like characters being influenced by Kant in their understanding of the world. But there's other philosophers referenced as well. Right at the end, where did this name go? This was somebody I hadn't heard of. Right at the end of the book, it is said that Nikolai has become interested in the philosophy of Grigory Skovoroda, who was a Ukrainian philosopher, actually around the same time as Kant, although none of his work was published within his lifetime because it was censored by the church. I've kind of Googled a little bit about him. He sounds pretty interesting, um, but I have not read any of his stuff yet. Um, and then also, so this is not referenced in the work, but it should be noted that Andrei Bely had a lot of philosophical and spiritual interests himself in real life. So um, he was part of this sort of social circle of Russian symbolist writers around the turn of the 20th century, and a lot of them had interesting philosophical ideas that probably influenced this book in some ways. But also he was a follower of Rudolf Steiner, who, and I had the Wikipedia page pulled up for this. So Rudolf Steiner was the leader of a philosophical and spiritual movement around the early 20th century called anth- anthroposophy. Anthroposophy. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I'll read the first chunk of the Wikipedia page here. Anthroposophy is a spiritual new religious movement which was founded in the early 20th century by the esotericist Rudolf Steiner that postulates the existence of an objective, intellectually comprehensible spiritual world accessible to human experience. Um, so you can see how this is probably somewhat influenced by uh, German idealism, and probably also by Platonic philosophy, and probably Neoplatonic philosophy in particular. But it's kind of integrating that with some of these spiritual ideas around the turn of the 20th century from people like Madame Blavatsky that would end up being a huge influence on the New Age stuff towards the end of the 20th century. Um, so yeah, really interesting, and Belly was really into that stuff. I think that would be another thing to do before a reread would be to read about all of that and then kind of reread this through the lens of how is it influenced by that. Another thing I have to point out, Belly in this book is very interested in the Asianness of Russia, for lack of a better term. He's so the Ablyukovs, Nikolai Apollonovich and Apollon Apollonovich, their surname is Ablyukov, and the opening of the book, the first couple paragraphs of the book are talking about the origin of their surname and how it comes from like Central Asia, and how they're descended from like these Turco-Mongolic people who came into Central Asia with the sorry, the cat's knocking stuff over, who came into Central Asia during the time in which Russia and Central Asia were ruled over by the Mongol Empire. Um, so Belly is very interested in all of that and how that influences Russia's identity. And I will say at times his interest in Russia's Asianness definitely verges on Orientalism. Um, but it's the thing about Orientalism in Russian art and literature is that it's like, and I'm not saying this makes it better or worse, but it's very different from Orientalism in, say, British art or literature because it's like, if like a Western European writer or artist is being Orientalist in their portrayal of Asia or Asian cultures, it's like we're as exoticizing the East and look how different and Eastern it is, you know. Whereas when Russia does Orientalism, it's almost like they're doing the same thing, but they're not doing it to position Asia as the other. They're doing it to identify themselves with this Orientalist vision of Asia and to distance themselves from Europe. There's this political strain within Russian nationalism called Eurasianism that um, was like just sort of starting to form around the time that this was written. It doesn't become like a movement or a political philosophy until the later 20th century, but like the roots of it are present in Russia at the time that it's written, and you can certainly see that in this book. Um, so that's there, and I needed to touch on that. Um, so yeah, I don't know. This book is really interesting and it's really good. Another thing I should note. So this is the Robert Maguire and John E. Malmsted translation, which is so. How should I go about explaining this? There's two versions of Petersburg by Andrey Bely. There's one that he published in 1913, and then there's one that he published in 1922. The 1922 version is quite a bit shorter and it's revised in certain ways, but literary critics usually prefer the 1913 version. This translation is from the 1922 version. So there's four translations, two of the 1913 version, two of the 1922 version. This is generally considered the best translation in terms of preserving Bely's style, but it is a translation of the 1922 version, which in the original Russian is generally considered to be inferior to the 1913 version. So there are two translations in English of the superior version, the 1913 version. I don't have either of those, but maybe I would look for one of those on a reread because I didn't know about all this, the two different versions and the four different translations. I didn't know about this when I first bought the book. But yeah, I think I want to find a translation of the uh 1913 version if I can. I could also try to read it in Russian. I speak Russian fairly well, but I don't know, it's this is an intimidating book to try to read in a language that's not your native language. Like I wouldn't expect um an English language learner to be comfortable reading James Joyce, and this is like the Russian James Joyce. So I don't know. I'm not saying that like an English as a second language speaker couldn't ever read James Joyce. I'm sure they could, and I would want them to if they're able to. I think everybody should experience James Joyce at some point, but I wouldn't blame them for being intimidated, and I'm intimidated by reading this in Russian. So I don't know. That may or may not ever happen, but there are two different English translations available of the other version of the book, so I might try to find one of those. But yeah, I did enjoy this. I think I think a couple other of Bely's works might be available in English as well, so maybe I'll look into that. But um, I really want to do kind of a wider survey of the symbolist movement. I've got a novel by Valery Bryusov upstairs that I'm going to read at some point, and a lot of the other Russian symbolists are not available in English, but that's also when I get to a point where I feel comfortable and confident enough to translate Russian literature, that is the area that I think I want to kind of focus on because It's really fascinating time in Russian literature, and I feel like it's under discussed. I feel like when people talk about Russian literature, they're either talking about like the Soviet era or they're talking about the 19th century, but there's these couple decades in between that are really interesting. Um, but people just don't talk about them as much. Um, so yeah, I know Valery Bryusov has stuff in English, but I think the other Russian symbolists, I think you gotta just speak Russian, which I do, thankfully. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see. I'll get into that. That's one of my goals this year is to start diving deeper into that. Uh, and yeah, I've started reading philosophy this year, which I'd never really done, at least not Western philosophy before this year. So um, yeah, I think that stuff will help me if I reread this someday. I do recommend this. I did like this translation, so if you're fine with reading the 1922 version, I did. This is a good translation of it. But yeah, I imagine a lot of people would prefer to find the 1913 version. So I don't know, but yeah, very good book. Yeah, I feel like I've said this about the last several books I've reviewed, but I do want to reread this someday. And yeah, hopefully I'll be back soon.